afternoon, everyone. So wonderful to be here with you all. So today I'm going to be doing a talk about the work I've been doing at New America, but as was stated in the intro, I'm also the Games Lab coordinator at New Mexico State University. And so in this session, I'm going to talk about representation and some work that I've done at New America, and then how that applies to game design and development. So just to give you a little sense, so New America works with different institutions to focus on access to digital technology. We focus on economic opportunities, thinking about thriving with families, creating equitable, accessible, and high-quality education, also equal representation in our politics and accountability of governance, and then also thinking about American values, not only within America itself, and also abroad. So we're really kind of a policy think tank that really takes research into practice and really thinks about all the ways in which we can make America better, as well as within the broader context. So then within New America, we have an education policy group. And so I'm specifically going to talk about the work with the education policy program. And so with them, they do work on early childhood and elementary education, English language learners, higher ed, and then specifically they have some work with the teaching, learning, and tech team that really talks about using research and policy analysts to think about solutions, generate ideas of how to address issues within educational systems, media, and technologies. So very broad and very different aspects of that within the community itself, various different sub-programs. And so within the sub-program, teaching, learning, and tech, so I'm getting really more specific so you kind of get a sense of where kind of the origin of this research report originated. So within that team, we have been able to get funded by the Hewlett and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And so with them, we've had an inclusive teaching and tech program. And it's a specific initiative that really has three focuses. So we spotlight on digital teaching and learning environments, both inside and outside the classroom, so thinking of different ways that learning happens. We highlight promising practices and how that connects to students and educators, and thinking about cultural responsiveness, open educational materials, and also thinking about the production of resources and information that fill in these knowledge gaps. So we're really trying to focus in on these three different areas through this specific initiative. And so just to give you an example of some of the things that we've already done. So we've done a report on embracing culturally responsive practices, media mentorship. We've had convenings about bringing in different stakeholders within the educational community to talk about digital equity. We've also done work in OER and pre-K spaces, as well as LGBTQ inclusive teaching and learning practices. And so this is all available on our website. So if you go to newamerica.org, you go to the education policy, you'll find in the teaching, learning, tech team, you'll be able to see a lot of these papers. So I kind of want you to, check those out if you haven't already. And so the report itself, we've done some work in culturally responsive practices. And so Jenny Muniz, who's been at New America, now she's on to another place, but she did this report that talked about 8 competencies of culturally responsive practices. And so within that report itself, I really kind of took that to really build on that to think about how does, what do materials say currently? What is the current state of educational kind of materials? And really thinking about it from the culturally responsive education lens, specifically thinking about materials themselves and how they represent students, because that's one of the key components of the 8 components of culturally responsive education. And so this is a research report, and the research report itself synthesizes 160 studies, a meta-analysis. I definitely reviewed more than 160 studies, but those are the ones that made it to this research report. And really there were 2 focuses of the research report. One, talking about culturally responsive materials and student learning, kind of making that connection, and then also what are the frequencies of different social groups. And for this research report, it only focused on racial, ethnic, and gender groups, but obviously some of those findings could probably be extrapolated, or even if people want to replicate doing a similar sort of meta-analysis, they can do that. And this is also available on our site. I'm really going to go over some of the key findings really quickly, but please go to the report itself, check it out. It's very lengthy and pretty descriptive. So within educational materials, one of the things we wanted to find out was like, why does this even matter? Why is it important for student learning? What does the research say about that? And so when we looked at the influence, there were 3 big ideas that seemed to resonate. There was mirrors and windows, societal curriculum, and identity development. And so I'm going to look at each one of those very briefly. So when we think about mirrors and windows, think about the work of Radun Sims Bishop, who basically talked about mirrors being materials that reflect and make connections to students' experience, and windows that expose them to different experiences and perspectives. And so what the research says is a few different things, that students receive support in oral language development when they have materials that are both windows and mirrors, that it engages them in the learning process. They ask questions, they complete assignments, they want to learn about people in different circumstances and different perspectives, as well as it enhances their curiosity about specific careers, particularly when that career itself reflects them. And so then we'll talk about societal curriculum with Carlos Cortez, wrote a lot about that. And that's really talking about how media directly or indirectly teaches the learners really about like languages, attitudes, beliefs, and like cross-cultural knowledge, and informs them about how society values different social identity markers, and as a result, how society then itself values them based on those social identity markers. And it ranges from positive to negative, so societal curriculum can be a wide range. And then when we talk about identity development, Common Sense Media has done a lot of research on that. And so they have they look at gender development, where they look at 3 aspects of it, and then they find out different ways in which gender development, like traditional kinds of media, impacts learners' understanding of themselves based on different stereotypes, as well as how the representation of different gender identities impacts how they view careers. And then they also looked at racial and ethnic development, and they found 5 dimensions of those, and really thinking about how children shape their understanding and their knowledge about themselves based on their racial and ethnic identity. And so in this particular report that they did, they found 5 different aspects of that. And then itself, they found research to kind of support where that comes from and how it impacts identity development. So for example, one of the things that they found in some of the research was how different stereotypic portrayals impact students' self-esteem, their value, their ability, their confidence in their own ability. And so then, after kind of having that establishment of these are the different ways in which, materials influence students, whether it's learning, understanding of self, and how different aspects of that happens. So then I looked at really how often are different social groups represented in different educational materials. And so one way that was reviewed was through the frequency itself. And so when we think about frequency, I did an analysis of different points. This is just one of the tables that's presented. This is in the research report itself. So there's an issue brief that's a follow-up to the research report, which is also available on New America's website, that has this specific table. But I thought it was interesting to examine what was the disparity between one recent study that was done of children's picture books and then the US Census. And so if you notice, the darker color is the frequency of portrayals within the books, and then the lighter color is of the demographics, this US Census. And this is not counting the undercount. So this happened before the undercount. And so we notice a disparity between what groups are presented in materials in like the US population census results. And so then another thing that was noticed was, and so that actually was similar to a fair amount of books, studies of of children's picture books, and so that it's also available in the research report itself. It was also found in textbooks. So one study that looked at U.S. history textbooks found that there was a high percentage of white European Americans being presented in historical textbooks, but when it comes to BIPOC communities, there was it was significantly lower with some groups as low as like 1%. So some communities aren't even presented in the historical materials itself that learners are consuming in their educational spaces. And so then when we think about gender representation and frequency, there's been a fair amount of those. And so this one just took different studies, that table, and it took different studies. And so we noticed that, back basically in like the 1960s, area, there was like 90%, and then we see it kind of like oscillate and kind of progress, but still not quite 50%. The other thing to note is that gender tends to be analyzed from a binary perspective, and that there are rare depictions of non-binary people within the curriculum itself. And that when we looked at intersectional identity, so intersection being race and ethnicity and gender, then we found that females typically tend to be ethnically or racially white, and that's also true for non-binary communities, as well as for BIPOC characters tend to be male. So then when we think about, okay, now we know who's seen, how often, now how are they presented? This is a little trickier, and I will say in the research report, this is a lot more robust. And so what we did was for the issue brief, that's a really brief table that kind of summarizes some of the points from the issue brief itself that notices how different communities, racial and ethnic communities are presented. And then there was another study that took themes of different books that learners consume, and then grouped different racial and ethnic groups by themes. And I was interested in noticing, which groups had more appearances of everyday experiences, which themes were more common for experiences of oppression. And so I would, suggest, taking a look at those sorts of studies. And so just to summarize really quickly, kind of what are some commonalities to kind of pull from, or if I'm not going to go into depth for this talk, kind of here's some 3 things that were noticed. There are narrow and problematic portrayals for different communities it's like a main reference to a specific region, a specific region or maybe warlike behavior. Then there's also positive and promising depictions, which tend to use language if in an accurate context. And it also shows people within everyday society experiencing circumstances. Because there's often an erasure of specific groups, as you hear, like some groups are low as 1%. And so, usually thinking about people in contemporary times and dealing with issues. And then also there's inaccurate and misleading and incomplete information. So sometimes that's related to historical events or who was or weren't a part of specific civil rights issues. Sometimes that happened in forms of how customs and traditions were presented about different communities. And so, but within each racial and ethnic group, there tended to be some significant nuances. And so then when we think about gender groups, so within individual identities, with females, they tend to be passive and dependent, though there is some movement towards a counter. For non-binary, there's a lack of diverse gender groups presented and their contributions to our society overall. And that identity within non-binary, like characters that feature non-binary characters, their identity may be seen as problematic for other people within that story that have to be resolved or shifted. And then when we think about intersectional identities, there's a limited amount of studies on those, but there were sometimes limitations based on traditional behavior, which could be related to gender or their specific racial and ethnic group, and that there were still some affirming and positive, and sometimes within that was culturally accurate, and some that were projections of what would be seen as positive for like maybe white European American culture, but maybe not Native or Indigenous culture. So that's just one example, and that's specifically referenced in the report itself. So 3 takeaways that were we're seeing or kind of surmise from all of this data was once creating a sense of belonging and thinking about that from the sense of the US context as well as within educational spaces. So then also developing cultural authenticity was one, with thinking about characters and activities and making sure that that was really authentic to, and true to what would happen. And then recognizing nuanced identity itself, both from a story perspective as well as from a character perspective. And so then when you're taking all this information as developers and designers, what is it that we should really think about when we're developing educational materials, or probably just materials in general? So there's the issue brief itself, that's a follow-up, has some of these questions posed. So some of the questions that were posed for designers to consider was thinking about content in particular. Is it historical, presenting different perspectives? Are social groups presented in a variety of roles? Does your team maybe revisit or review materials? And is there an evaluation process? And so if the answer is probably no, then it might be time to just kind of revise some different parts of the design process itself. And so here's some suggestions. So we did a convening of developers and designers of educational materials. And so for this, I'm going to emphasize 2 points from it, but we've just posted, as in today, posted the takeaways from the roundtable convening, which has a lot more information that the designers and developers, and we curated designers and developers from different institutions who work with different populations to really get a sense of what are the challenges or opportunities when developing materials that's culturally responsive and considers digital equity and open educational materials. And so these are 2 of the points that was presented in the roundtable, but I would recommend to go to our website and review it yourself and maybe have discussions with peers or even within your own design team. So one is defining culturally responsive practices. And so we need to create kind of a broader understanding of what it means beyond diversity and gender, but really to think about specifically dual language learners, thinking about English language learners, and as well as different body sizes, different body shapes. So really kind of broadening what does diversity mean. Recognizing that identity is multi-layered and isn't always related to certain specific categories, and that we really need to consider students' cultural stories, their history, their geography, all these different pieces. And then the second part is thinking about the design and development process. And so that could be integrating inclusive practices that consider cultural identity, experiences, defining expertise beyond doctoral degrees, but thinking about valuing lived experiences. So really kind of expand notion what is an expert, hiring team members that represent different perspectives, communities, and also co-designing between developers and community members itself in each stage of the product's design, not just at one specific part or towards the end, but really having them integrated and involved in the design process. So at New America, we're going to keep doing things. We're going to keep building research as a foundation, and we're going to keep convening learning communities and translating research into policy recommendations, all in the hopes of creating ways to determine ways that educators and stakeholders can use new media and technologies to promote a more equitable systems of learning in culturally responsive ways. So we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep doing this kind of work. Please, stay engaged with us. Again, I want to say thank you to New America staff. So I've been a part of an amazing team of inclusive tech folks who always give feedback, as well as all the participants for all of our roundtables that we've developed, had different stakeholders within education spaces, and recently the designers and developers. And then also thank you to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for supporting this kind of work. So feel free to stay connected to us. Again, you can sign up for our newsletters. We post about our newsletters regularly when we have different reports or different blog pieces that are coming out. So please stay tuned with New America in that way. Follow us on social media and any other ways you would like to connect. So thank you so much for listening to this talk, and I hope some of the points resonated with you and your team. you.